jointly by the U.S. Forest Service and the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. We have quite a very large audience here today. It's delighted to have so many people on the phone line to hear Dr. Frank Thompson talk about conserving disturbance-dependent wildlife and forested landscapes of the eastern United States. A couple housekeeping details before we get started here. First of all, the webinar is being recorded, and so we will have the recording available on the AFWA website, fishwildlife.org, which you can access at some point after the webinar concludes. Second of all, we do ask that for those of you who are not speaking that you mute your line, especially during the opening introduction and then the Q&A that follows at the end. And we do ask this because we so often get extraneous noises on the line. It makes it difficult for other people to hear. So out of courtesy to the speaker and to the other listeners, we do ask that you mute the line. The other I'd like at this point to turn it over to my good friend and colleague Monica Thomasy with the Forest Service to provide an introduction to the webinar series and to the speaker. Monica.
Thanks, Jonathan. And again, if everyone could mute your line if you're not the one speaking, that would be great. We usually have about 100 people, and it just takes one or two to create some background noise if the line's not muted. So thanks, Jonathan, for another opportunity to connect biologists and managers with some more of the work we do in the Forest Service Wildlife and Fisheries Research Programs for the management community in the nation. Through this AFWA webinar series, we're able to address many questions that the state and other biologists have about what's being done on topics of current concern and who's conducting the research. If anyone listening now has a particular wildlife or natural resource topic of interest that you'd like us to cover, please send a request to Jonathan Maudsley. Today's topic was requested due to the increasing discussions that stakeholders and agencies and nonprofit organizations are having on early successional forests as wildlife habitat. In response, today we are providing one illustration of some of the science behind the management for early successional species through some research produced in the central part of the country. Frank Thompson is one of several Forest Service research wildlife biologists who's working on early seral stage wildlife habitat.
Okay.
I appreciate Frank's willingness to be the spokesperson for this webinar, especially since Frank was one of the scientists who helped to raise this concern for early successional birds back in the mid-1990s.
Okay.
Frank produces information needed for wildlife conservation strategies. He develops tools and technologies to assist conservation planners and managers in planning wildlife conservation at large spatial scales. This involves the development of integrated landscape change, wildlife habitat, viability models that can be used with existing data sources and GIS products over large areas such as states and ecological regions. Frank's research products have been used extensively to meet wildlife management objectives in much of the eastern United States. Thank you, Frank.
Before Frank gets started, I did want to remind folks to mute their lines again. And we are going to mute all lines and then bring up Frank's line when he starts speaking. But before Frank gets started, I did want to let everyone know, because of the very large number of people on today's call, if you do have a question for the speaker, we ask that you type it in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner. And if we have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation, we'll start with those first. And then if we have time, we'll go to an open line Q&A. But if you have a question for Frank, please do type it in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. We will be reading those through at the end as time allows. At this point, I'm going to mute the lines, and then we're going to bring up Frank's line for the presentation.
The conference has been muted.
Frank, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. If we can get started with the first slide. Well, thanks everyone for calling in today, and I have to say it's a real pleasure to talk about this topic. During my whole career as a Forest Service scientist, which is approaching 30 years now, this is a topic I've worked out throughout. And when I first started with the agency, I was very focused on forest management effects on birds, and this was at the time that conservation of migrant birds was becoming a big issue with partners in flight. Now, some of this interest around early successional birds first coalesced back in 2000 and 2001 when Dick DeGraff, Margaret Trainey, and I co-edited a special issue of the Wildlife Society Bulletin specifically on conservation of woody early successional habitats and wildlife. Then, almost exactly 10 years later, in 2011, Katie Greenberg, who's on the call, Bev Collins, and I, we co-edited a book on sustaining young forest communities. And now here we are, 6 years later, still talking about this topic. So it's a topic that continues to be of interest for a variety of reasons that hopefully I'll touch on throughout my talk. Next slide, please. So this is what I'm going to cover today. First, I want to begin and just make a few clarifying remarks about what we mean by early successional and disturbance-dependent wildlife and habitats. And then I'll talk briefly about why we're concerned about early successional wildlife. And then I'm going to go on for the bulk of my presentation and talk about some of our new research that's just now being reported on relative to this topic. And that's going to include some new work on responses of early successional birds to woodland restoration in the Midwest, and then also some exciting new work that shows how we can use models in conservation planning and landscape conservation design that will address management and climate change, show you some results that are particularly relevant to early successional wildlife, and then try to make some summary points. Next slide, please. So, what we mean by early successional habitat and wildlife. Habitat's usually considered the set of specific environmental features that's required by a species. Now, often, though, we kind of equate this for wildlife as a plant community, a vegetation association, or a cover type. So when we talk about early successional habitat, we're usually referring to early stages of succession for types or sets of plant communities, vegetation associations, or cover types that are used by some species of interest. And within this context, a community can most simply be defined in a very general way as simply a group of species living in the same place. So next slide. So, ecological succession, and usually for managers we're talking about the process of secondary succession, is simply the process of change in the structure and composition of an ecological community over time. So for our interest today, we're usually talking about what happens after some management activity or some substantial disturbance event that resets succession in a community, such as a fire, and then the early stages of that succession typically go through some pretty predictable stages, from open or bare ground, through grasses and forbs, invading woody shrubs and trees, and then eventually pioneer tree species and going through the typical stages of land development. So for early successional habitats, we're usually talking about what's kind of shown here in panels 5, 6, and 7. Everything from those grassland habitats being invaded by the first woody species to right up to even young, dense seedling sapling stands. Next slide, please. So here's just some pictures that represent some of those examples. So again, beginning on the top left, and let's go clockwise, we can be talking about a grassland habitat, and then in the absence of disturbance, that's going to get invaded by woody invaders such as shrubs and trees. We can talk about old fields and shrubland habitats that, again, in the absence of disturbance, are going to be invaded by trees and eventually succeed to forest. Or we can even be talking about the early stages of forest stand development, such as a dense seedling sapling stand. And then finally, on the bottom left, a little bit more unique perhaps are the ideas of savannas and woodlands as early successional habitats. These are clearly disturbance dependent, but unique in that they have this partial overstory of mature trees yet the ground cover can have many of the attributes of these other early stages of succession. Common attribute of all of these, however, is they're very dependent on disturbance. Next slide, please. So why are we concerned about this? Why are we concerned about early successional wildlife species in these communities? Well, it's really pretty simple, and that's that most early successional disturbance-dependent wildlife species have exhibited long-term population declines in abundance. And it's not just that they've declined, it's often that the levels they have reached recently, we're concerned that we don't have enough of them. So it's the fact that we see these historic declines and are concerned about their current abundances. So I'm just going to go through a couple of examples, actually for the species pictured here, to show you some of the evidence for that, so we get an idea of what the magnitude of these declines is that we're talking about, before I go on to talk about some of our relevant research. So next slide, please. So in preparation for this talk, I thought I would just quickly summarize the most recent analyzed BBS data. So these are data from the North American Breeding Bird Survey for the Eastern U.S. region from 1966 to 2013, and I simply summarize the numbers of species that have significant declines or significant increases, and I did this by the traditional breeding bird survey habitat groups or guilds, and those are listed across the bottom. So grassland, successional or scrub species, woodland forest species, wetland species, and urban species. And the bars simply represent the proportion of species in each group that either show a significant increase or decrease. Green being increases, red being decreases. And then those numbers across the tops of the bars, that represents the mean trend for that group and the number of species in that group. So very simply, the only point I want to make with this slide right now is if we look at the grassland and successional species, by and large, very few species have positive trends, and a large proportion, more than half in both groups, have significant negative trends. And if we look by comparison to woodland and wetland species, fewer species show declines, more species show increases. So this is one quick cut across bird communities in the East to give you some indication about the numbers of declines. But this kind of summary doesn't really give you an idea of what those declines look like. So let's go to a couple of these focal species, and let's look at the next slide, please. So here, for the prairie warbler, this is the actual estimates of annual abundance across the Eastern U.S. based on the breeding bird survey data over that time period. And for that time period, you can see the average birds per route has more than decreased by 50%, and it has been a pretty consistent long-term decline over the duration of the breeding bird survey. Next slide, please. So while I've spent most of my career working with non-game birds, particularly migrant songbirds, outside of my work life, I've got a particular passion for gallinaceous birds and upland game birds. So here's an example from bobwhites. And northern bobwhites show an even more precipitous decline than that songbird I just showed you. If you can take a look at the magnitude of this decline over the history of the BBS, from over 50 birds per route to fewer than 10 birds per route on average at present. Now, I don't want to just use examples from the breeding bird survey, but it is one of the best examples because of its long time frame. But next slide, please, is for the American woodcock. This is based on another volunteer citizen science program, but it's based on singing ground surveys. And again, you can see long-term precipitous declines of this bird that is very dependent on early successional habitats and young forest. Next slide, please. So why are we seeing these widespread declines across many different taxonomic groups of birds? And I'm just focusing on birds, but we could be talking about some mammals as well. This is a conceptual diagram that represents long-term, large-scale changes in land use in the U.S. I think this first came from a paper by John Levitas on patterns in New England, or perhaps Dick DeGraff, I actually forget. But the main point here is we've had this early history of clearing for settlement and agriculture abandonment that created an increase in many successional habitats. But then throughout most of our lifetime, we've been in this stage of forest maturation, and that has kind of concluded within recent years with even greater fire suppression and, at least in some regions, not all, reduced harvest levels. Now, as I said, this is kind of a conceptual illustration because we don't have good numbers going this far back. But if we go to the next slide, we can actually look at some hard data on this. This is from the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. And what I'm showing here are patterns in tree age class distribution summarized from the FIA program for 10 eastern states, and there's a line in there in the middle that represents the total across all those states. And this curve here is a legacy of that past history of land use. And so what you clearly see is we've got this glut of mid-successional forest, a very big deficit in very old forest, and also a deficit in very young forest. So to put this in perspective, if we were managing a forest or a landscape to create sustained amounts of different age classes of forest over a 100-year rotation, we would expect a level line at about 10% in each 10-year age class. And so we can see we've really deviated, at least from that concept. Not that that's necessarily a goal, but it's often one that's talked about. So there's a deficit of young forest on many parts of the eastern landscape. Not all. This does vary regionally. Next slide, please. So that was age class distributions of what FIA calls forest land. But there's some other significant early successional or disturbance-dependent communities that are important for wildlife that maybe aren't captured very well by those statistics. And in particular, oak and pine savannas and woodlands within the Midwestern and Southern U.S. These communities, by different authors, have been suggested to be at much less than 1% of their original historic extent in the Midwest and Southern U.S., so much less common on the landscape. Next slide, please. So these habitats, and here is an example of a pine woodland, are characterized by a moderate overstory of pines or oaks and pines, typically ranging from 10 to 80 or 90%. But the key characteristic of them is due to fire and or grazing, there's generally an absence of a mid-story, and that permits a dense or abundant and diverse ground flora and sometimes even a partially woody understory. Next slide, please. So these pine savannas and woodlands were once much more common in the Midwest and South, originally represented by millions of hectares and now thousands of hectares. They were maintained by fire and grazing, so they're clearly disturbance-dependent, similarly to other successional habitats. And we've lost much of the original extent due to land use conversion, fire suppression, and succession. Next slide, please. So, given that concerns for this particular community or structure, many federal and state agencies and NGOs are now working very hard to restore savanna and woodlands on the landscape. Some of that is because there's known benefits both in terms of overall diversity, but also to focal species such as bobwhite and turkey. But actually, we don't really have good knowledge on the impacts of this restoration to the broader bird community, and maybe to some of the specific early successional species we're focused on today. There's also some controversy about large-scale restoration because we're talking about large landscape burning as well as thinning operations. Next slide, please. So, in response to some of those concerns and issues, we were part of a study with some collaborators to look at breeding bird response to pine, savanna, and woodland restoration in the Ozark and the Ouachita Highlands. I want to acknowledge, importantly, Melissa Roach was the master student who's worked in this study and whose results I'm going to be showing. And we also worked with several important collaborators, including Todd Jones-Farron from the Gulf Coast Plains and Ozarks LCC, Jane Fitzgerald with the Central Hardwoods Joint Venture, and Brian Davidson from the Mark Twain National Forest, and Mary Lane from the Ouachita National Forest. Next slide, please. So what we did is we surveyed bird abundance at 350 points across the Mark Twain and Ouachita's cooperative forest landscape restoration projects. Those points are shown in these two globs of blue points, which at this scale you can't really separate. At these points, we, over each of 3 years, we surveyed bird abundance using state-of-the-art techniques to estimate density. But we also monitored success of 462 nests in 2 of those years. And then we've related those densities and nest success to vegetation structure and management. And I want to talk about some of those results now. So next slide, please. So I'm going to break these results down by a couple of different habitat groupings. And I'm going to begin with the species we're talking or focusing on this morning, and that's early successional birds, or these birds can otherwise be characterized as either shrub or ground nesting species. So prairie warbler, Kentucky warbler, blue-winged warbler, yellow-breasted chat, Bachman sparrow, white-eye vireo, eastern towhee, and northern bobwhite. Now, unfortunately, in our bird surveys, we weren't able to detect enough bobwhites or Bachman sparrows to really model their abundance. But I am going to talk, at least in general, about the other species and what we found. Next slide, please. So this is a summary slide, and then I'll show you some specific relationships after this. But all I've done here is I've looked at those focal species for which we could actually model density and characterize the responses to 3 broad areas: fire, as in prescribed fire, thinning, or canopy closure or tree density. Now these 3 areas were actually represented by a couple dozen variables all told, but I've summarized that just to present this generalization here to kind of make the take-home points without a lot of the detail. So the point I want you to see here is all of these species responded to either fire or thinning and also to structure. And they responded in the ways you would expect for an early successional species. Prescribed fire and thinning have positive effects, and they have a negative relationship to canopy closure or tree density. So let me show you specifically what a couple of these relationships look like. Next slide, please. So here's fire effects for prairie warbler. So in all these graphs I'm going to show you, the Y or vertical axis is density in terms of males per hectare. And in this case, we're going to look at response to the total number of burns over a 10-year period, or the percent of the area around the point that was burned in the last 10 years. So in this case for prairie warbler, you can see a doubling to tripling in abundance with the increasing use of fire in this landscape. So a strong positive response. Next slide, please. So here's another one of the species, blue-winged warbler, and here's an example for thinning. So a similar positive response, in this case even a larger magnitude of increase in abundance in relationship to the percent of the surrounding area that had been thinned in the last 10 years as part of this pine woodland restoration. Next slide, please. Back to the prairie warbler, here's a nice slide showing effects of canopy cover, and over that slide I've kind of superimposed some of the typical breakpoints for what we would call savanna versus woodland versus forest. And again, you see the relationship where with more open canopies, we see nearly 4 times as many prairie warblers as we do in closed canopy forest. So these are the types of relationships we would have expected for early successional birds. What was of interest and somewhat surprising to me was the magnitude of the response and to the degree to which these habitats provided really good habitat for these early successional birds. And I'll provide some context for that in just a minute. Next slide, please. So, but what about nest success? Because we know we don't only want to judge habitat on a single demographic effect, and reproductive performance is surely important. Well, here's where the results get even more interesting. Next slide. We see the same kind of very positive response to both management and structure in nest success for these species. So for nest success, we focused on 3 of the early successional birds. And we see that with the increasing number of fires in this landscape, we see higher nest survival. Next slide, please. And also, we see a marked benefit for the amount of thinning in the landscape. So did a nest occur in an area that had been thinned or not thinned? Again, these early successional species had higher success in the thinned areas. So overall, positive response to management in both abundance and nest success. Next slide, please. So just to summarize this particular study, we looked at 16 species in total, 11 of which responded positively to woodland restoration. 9 of those 11 were actually species of conservation concern. And all of the early successional species responded positively, both in abundance and nest success, to the restoration and the structures that develop after you implement that type of management. Okay, next slide. So now we're going to move on to the second topic I wanted to, one other thing first. So I wanted to put this in context, this response by these birds to woodland restoration, to what we would see typically under a more classic silviculture approach, such as even age management or selection management or even thinning. And so I'm just going to briefly show you these 2 graphs for prairie warbler and yellow-breasted chat. This comes from the long-term forest ecosystem study in Missouri, MOFEP. And this is showing you response in abundances of these 2 birds over a long time, 1991 to 2010, to management which was implemented in 1996. And so you see, immediately after that management in 1996, these 2 successional birds respond very positively on the red line, which were the clear-cut treatments, and much less so, or not at all, to the selection and thinning treatments. And the other important point here is those responses, by the time you got to 10 years after the treatment, those bird abundances fall back down to virtually 0. So much more ephemeral response, and a different type of response perhaps than we would expect under woodland restoration. So how can we compare these 2 on a level playing field? Next slide, please. Well, that's what I tried to do here. This is a simple spreadsheet exercise I did just for this talk. Basically, I tried to contrast 3 landscapes. One which would be composed of forest age classes as they're currently represented in the Midwest. And by and large, we have a very small percentage of 1 to 10-year-old forest on these landscapes now. And so for the current landscape, think of that as a landscape with only about 2% of that landscape in 1 to 10-year-old forest. I'm going to contrast that with a landscape under balanced even age management, where 10% of the landscape is in 1 to 10-year-old forest. And then our third landscape scenario here is one that represents the historic distribution of these communities on this landscape. So 8% is in glades and savanna, 32% in open woodland, 40% in closed woodland, 20% closed canopy forest. So what I then did is I simply took the habitat relationships from those previous studies of silviculture and restoration, and I calculated what would be the total abundance in each of these landscapes. And that's what you can see in the blue, red, and green lines. So Acadian flycatchers and worm-eating warblers are the first 2 birds, then followed by the 3 early successional birds, prairie warbler, yellow-breasted chat, and indigo bunting. And again, somewhat surprising to me is that landscape managed for those woodland and savanna and glade communities actually compared very favorably, if not better, to a landscape under typical even age management. So woodland and savanna restoration certainly has the potential to meet the needs of at least these early successional species. That's certainly not true of all early successional species, because a point I'll make later is we need to always think about species-specific requirements. Next slide, please. So I want to move on now to the second study to illustrate some of these points on a bigger scale and bring in climate change because it's potentially going to be a huge driver in these landscapes. So, how can we use this knowledge of habitat relationships in conservation planning, and in particular planning for early successional species? Can we include drivers of population change such as management or restoration, land use change such as urbanization, or another important one in parts of this region will be conversion of natural stands to more intensive industrial forests, and as a big overarching factor across the landscape, climate change. And can we do this in a way that can provide a framework to help managers make decisions about how to design landscapes that can sustain these species? Next slide, please. So that's the study I want to talk about next. And this is a project that Tom Bono, a PhD student that worked with Josh Millspa and I, he led this effort, supported by the Gulf Coast Plains and Ozarks LCC, the Northeast Climate Science Center, and the Forest Service. Working with Todd Jones-Farrand here with the LCC, as well as some important collaborators from the states, because in this exercise, we went through a series of workshops with state participation, including Allison Fowler from Arkansas, Mark Howry from Oklahoma, and Nate Minix from Missouri. Next slide, please. And so our idea was here, how can we practice landscape conservation design with all the uncertainties of climate change and land use change for a suite of focal species? Now, the broader project looked at a number of species, but I'm just going to focus right now on examples for these two species, prairie warbler and brown-headed nuthatch. So we've already talked some about prairie warbler. For those of you who don't know brown-headed nuthatch, it's basically an obligate of pine woodlands, very dependent on these stands with fire and high snag densities and open pine woodlands. Next slide, please. So the whole process we went through here was the typical structured decision-making cycle of defining a problem, coming up with specific objectives, framing management alternatives or scenarios, evaluating the consequences of those, assessing trade-offs among them, and then providing the information for the decision makers to make a decision and take action. So the way that was done is Tom met through a couple of workshops and a series of webinars with the state participants and other members of the LCC, began with refining objectives, which came down to managing the risk of decline for these focal species, to defining conservation alternatives, and I'll frame those in just a minute, within and acknowledging the uncertainties about multiple climate futures, and also factoring in urbanization, which is a very big agent of land use change in this landscape. And then what we did is we used our modeling framework to evaluate or compare those alternatives. And I'll go into just a little bit of detail on this for you next. Next slide, please. So those management alternatives or restoration scenarios we considered, they varied in a few key priorities. First was the amount of management. So we had three levels or amounts. Basically, one was business as usual, the current levels of forest management in those landscapes. Then the second two options had to do with adding these restoration targets on top of that, and those restoration targets are illustrated in that graph for these communities, and whether we achieved 50% of that or 100% of that. So basically restoring communities such as glades, woodlands, and savannas across the landscape. It also varied by how we decided where to do that. Did we prioritize where management would happen based on the current landscape, the future landscape, or do it randomly? Did we do management just on protected lands, on private lands, or both? And then we acknowledged three different possible climate futures, basically current climate, a moderate climate change scenario, and a more extreme scenario. Next slide. So, how do we evaluate those factors? Well, just very briefly, we linked downscaled climate data with an ecosystem model called linkages and a landscape model called landus. And the combination of these let us project these landscapes forward in time, incorporating the effects of changing climate, management, and land use change. Basically what that then gave us is that every decade over the next century, a picture of what those landscapes would look like under each of those scenarios. We then interpreted those based on habitat models, which estimated key demographic rates for a population model. And our end goal here was to project these populations over time. And again, the objective was to try to look at the risk of declines under these different scenarios. Next slide, please. So what did we find? So I don't want you to try to sort through all these lines. I want to make just a couple of pretty simple points here. That bottom line in black is the business as usual scenario. That top line in blue is basically achieving the full restoration goals, managing across public and private lands, and prioritizing where management happened based on future landscapes that accounted for land use change and climate. And so you can see the difference here from business as usual, which resulted on average on continued decline of the prairie warbler, to actually reversing that decline under that top scenario, and then a number of different options in between. Now let's look at one more example. The next slide, please. So here's the example for the brown-headed nuthatch. A very similar result. Bottom scenario, the black, is business as usual. The top scenario, the same. Accounting for climate change and land use change, achieving full restoration targets, and both managing public and private lands. So I just want to try to make a couple of important summary points here and then start to summarize over my whole talk here. Next slide, please. So for this exercise on structured decision making and landscape conservation design with the GCPO, what did we learn? Well, we found out that landscape conservation design that included large-scale management and restoration efforts was in fact predicted to reverse long-term declines of a focal species. I think this is a very positive and optimistic, or not optimistic, but very positive result, saying that if we plan management at a sufficiently large scale and implement it at that scale, that we can in fact reverse regional declines, or are predicted to be able to reverse regional declines in a bird population. Second point, I think it's very interesting that populations responded better when planning factored in both future changes in land use and climate change and included management on both public and private lands. I think each one of those are important points to consider in landscape conservation design. Now, what I was not able to show you specifically here simply because of time is we could contrast those population projections under what they would be under if we assumed climate remained like it is currently versus we implemented it under one of those climate change scenarios. And in fact, for these two species, climate change actually results in increased habitat availability because climate and warming and drying facilitates additional savanna woodland within the region. So kind of an interesting result that's probably pretty specific to these two species. Lastly, we demonstrated that there are approaches that can be used with structured decision making and modeling that can enable conservation planning even with the uncertainty that exists among future climates. And I think that's a pretty powerful message too, that we can deal with uncertainty by acknowledging it and using some of these frameworks. Next slide, please. So now I want to summarize in general over the things I've talked about. So I certainly agree with many others that there are reasons to be concerned about the status of early successional wildlife. And perhaps just very simply, it's because these species are often habitat specialists and they're dependent on very ephemeral conditions that require repeated disturbance or management. A point that I wasn't able to dwell on too much with results, but that I really want to emphasize now, is we have to remember habitat requirements are species specific. So while I've been using the term early successional wildlife or disturbance-dependent wildlife, we're talking about dozens or hundreds of species that have species-specific requirements. Many of them have some similarities and commonalities, and that main commonality is the need for recurring disturbance or management. Next, both ecosystem restoration and traditional silviculture approaches such as even and uneven age management both have roles in managing forests and woodlands and habitats for many early successional species. Which practices are used and in which combinations, again, are going to depend on species-specific requirements and other driving objectives for the management. It's inarguable that timber management can generate revenues, whereas savanna woodland restoration can be expensive. So how we implement these has to factor in many different factors across the landscape. Again, one of the interesting points I want to make from these more recent studies is they do show the potential large magnitude of response of these species to these types of restoration management practices, though. Okay, next, the interaction between land management, forest management, and climate change is going to be very important to the future habitat availability for these species. Again, I could not go into much detail about our modeling of climate change impacts on landscapes, but I can tell you that in the near term, management remains the primary driver of what's on the landscape, but its interaction with long-term climate change effects in the long term becomes the major determinant. Management can accelerate or slow down the eventual changes that will happen with climate change. Then lastly, to end this on, again, a very positive note, I hope, is that we have modeling and planning frameworks that can be used within contemporary ideas about landscape conservation design to address these issues. These are big, complex, wicked problems and issues, but we have approaches that can acknowledge uncertainty, bring people together, and give them the information they need as decision makers to choose options. Thanks, and I'm going to stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank, for that excellent presentation. We received quite a number of comments in the question box and the chat box, and we will do our best to work through those in the time that we have allotted. It's a little before 3 p.m. Eastern Time, so we're going to try to work through as many of these questions as we can. This has been a really great presentation. We've had a very large number of people on the phone calling in for it, and we appreciate, Frank, all of the information that you've shared with us today. So we'll start here with a question from Sharon Petzinger. While more early successional birds are declining and at steeper rates than forest birds, they are also more abundant than many of the forest birds, for example, prairie warblers and red-shouldered hawks. Why should we manage for prairie warblers and other early successional species? And if we do manage for them, how do we balance negative impacts of management on red-shouldered hawks and other interior forest species?
So that's a great question, and it's one as a researcher, I don't have to deal with the consequences of it because I'm not making management decisions. But I agree with your premise that it's not just about trends or steepness of trends. It's about how many are on the landscape. And so it comes down to, do you have as many as you want? And I would argue or agree with you that in some places that may be true, but in many places I would argue that many of the forest species are much more abundant than these early successional species. So I think it depends where you are and which species you're talking about. And I agree that in the end it comes down to establishing appropriate population levels as conservation targets to sustain these species in the landscape. And ultimately it's at the levels that people want. So it's a social issue too. So I don't presume that just because these species are declining, their management takes precedence over other species. Let's consider what reasonable population targets are for management and look at how to achieve those. And to Partners in Flight's credits, that's an issue they've been trying to grapple with, setting real conservation targets for landscapes.
Great, thank you very much. Question here from Mike Berger. Do you have any data showing how density of species that nest in more mature forests is related to total amount of fire or thinning and or proportion of areas burned or thinned?
We do. So that's another great question. I thank you for that. So I only showed you the data on the early successional species. We also monitored canopy nesting birds that would be considered woodland species, as well as typical forest nesting species. And as you would expect, species like ovenbird, wood thrush, worm-eating warbler in the Midwest, their abundance decreases with the increased use of fire in the landscape. So yes, you need to factor in all species and their place in the landscape. The reality is, though, fire throughout most of these eastern forests is always going to be of a very limited extent, and I don't think we're ever going to implement enough fire to dramatically change their abundance. But yes, those species are sensitive to both fire and thinning, and often in negative ways. Now, some of those canopy nesting woodland species, such as pine warblers, summer tanagers, eastern peewees, they all showed benefits to lower canopy closure and fire, and even in their nesting success. So species that you would think of as canopy-dwelling woodland species, in fact, they all responded positively too. So just add that in there too.
Great, thank you. Question from Jason Stevens. What role do you see livestock grazing having in the suite of tools to create and or maintain early successional habitat?
So I can't even comment on that, to be honest. I've got no experience with grazing impacts. Clearly, grazing was one of those disturbance agents in many of these eastern woodlands and savannas. We've lost many of those large grazers, but I can't say anything about grazing by current livestock in these systems, other than I know some people are experimenting with it.
Great, thank you. Another question from Sharon Petzinger here in the queue. When discussing the data on the responses of birds to burning, when do you burn and at what severity, fuel reduction versus hot burn?
So it kind of varies over the restoration process. So, and again, I'm not the fire expert here. These burns were all done and supervised by the National Forest staff, and this restoration has been underway in some of these areas for about 10 years. And surely the burning conditions were very different when they brought those first burns in than with the latter burns. By and large, these forests are doing dormant season burning, but honestly, I can't say much more off the top of my head about the specifics. I will add one more thing, though. So we looked at the numbers of burns over the last 10 years. The way we fit these models, you saw that for the successional birds, it was increasing right up to as many as 5 or 6 burns in the last 10 years. We actually have just gone back and fit these as nonlinear relationships. And Melissa has promised me those results, but I haven't seen them yet. I suspect for some of these birds, as that burning frequency gets high, we're going to see the benefits start to drop off, so that probably a modest number of burns will benefit some birds more than continuing increasing numbers. That's a story that will be modified with some new results here.
Thank you. Question here from Patrick Rule. In addition to nest success, do you have any data on post-fledgling habitat use or survival for any of the early successional species in relation to total burn area or forest thinning?
So a great question, and I don't know if you knew that when you asked it, so that's one of the other passions in my research life, is looking at juvenile survival and habitat use in songbirds. And we've just finished some new work with birds such as Acadian flycatchers and ovenbirds by Julie Jenkins in forests. That work has yet to be done in these kind of burned and managed systems, and I think that's a really great next step. We're also trying to look at that within the context of another endangered bird, the golden-cheeked warbler down in ash juniper woodlands in Texas. So really good question, something that needs to be done, and hopefully we're going to get to that soon.
Great, thank you. Question here from Karen Pope. Have you explored why variance in target bird density increases with the forest thinning treatment? Are some thinning practices better than others?
Very good observation, and unfortunately it's not an ecological result, that's a pure statistical result. It's because very few nests or points had the larger number or amount of thinning. So when you've got less examples of that, when you estimate abundance, you simply have more uncertainty around the estimate at that level of thinning. So that's more of a sample size effect than a real ecological effect.
Great, thank you. Question from Bruce Marcoux. For your SDM model, did you test the potential effects of weighing public and private lands differently?
So thanks for that question, Bruce. So no, the initial project was a very simple summary comparing those alternatives and simply looking at, I'm trying to remember, the average risk of decline across all species was the way the trade-offs were assessed in the end. I think there's a lot of different things that could be looked at by Tom and others here as a follow-up to that, looking at different weightings that might factor in, for instance, the difficulty in doing management on public versus private lands and so forth. So really good question, and perhaps that's something we can look at in the future.
Great, thank you. Sandra Van Rankin asks if you can share any specifics on the uneven aged management studies.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back way far in time to start with. So we began looking at uneven age management in Missouri and the Midwest and published a paper in JWM, Elizabeth Annand and I, in 1992. And one of the concerns that came out of that paper was we saw the early successional birds like prairie warblers and chats showed very small response to selection methods as opposed to clear-cut methods. And that result kind of framed my expectations for a long time as we began to think about this restoration. And I was really concerned that these stands with partial canopies would have very limited responses by these early successional birds. And again, the MOFEP study essentially followed up on our earlier work. They implemented management within an experimental framework with randomization of treatments. They found the same result that our earlier work did, that species like chats and prairie warblers and blue-winged warblers had very limited response to partial cutting methods in forest. Now, what's evidently very different in savanna woodland restoration is while you have maybe similar canopy covers to those selection methods, we have something else. We have fire. And the introduction of fire over time eliminates the mid-story. And even though you have similar canopy covers, the absence of mid-story seems to facilitate the ground cover and potential shrub cover that's needed by these birds. So we see an equally robust response by them in savanna woodland management as we did the clear cuts, but we don't see that response in selection cutting.
Great, thank you very much. Question from Tanner Steves. Do any of these models predict where spatially on the landscape management efforts should be placed to have the largest positive effect at the population level?
So that's a really complex problem, and that gets into kind of spatial optimization. And unfortunately, these landscape change models that we're implementing these at reasonably small resolutions over huge landscapes, and there's just too many variables for us to try to get at true spatial optimization. So right now, the best we can do is we can develop alternative scenarios, run those scenarios, and compare the trade-offs. And so those scenarios included different approaches to spatially locating treatments, such as do we put them on protected or private lands? Do we optimize the benefit to birds by putting them in the largest contiguous landscapes, or do we do it randomly? And we see real trade-offs in those decisions. So if we can ever get to the point of spatial optimization, that would let us fine-tune that. But we just don't have the computer power or models to do that right now.
Great, thank you. And our last question here from Nicole Zimmerman. Can you compare changes in bird abundance or nesting success in burned versus thinned managed areas?
So right now, the way we analyze this data, Nicole, is we treat both burning and thinning as simple additive effects in a model. And so that lets us look at the potential additive benefit of either one or the other in combination. So the graphs I showed you didn't let you really pull that out, but we could produce predictions and graph them in a way that lets you look at those trade-offs. And the other thing that's of interest, I think, to us to do in a follow-up analysis is we didn't look at the interaction between fire and thinning. So for instance, does fire only have a benefit to prairie warblers if it's done where there's been at least some thinning? That requires a little more complex model with interactions. So we're going to be trying to look at that issue and better depict those trade-offs in our next round of analyses.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Frank, for that wonderful presentation. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and thank you for everyone who submitted excellent questions for today's speaker. At this point, I'm going to unmute the lines, and on behalf of the Association of Fish
The conference
and Wildlife
has been
Agents,
unmuted.
I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. And to close it out today, I'd like to turn it back over to my good friend and colleague Monica Thomasy at the Forest Service for some concluding remarks. Monica.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Frank, and thanks to the participants in the webinar. For more information on this subject, I recommend going to our search engine called Tree Search. That's one word, Tree Search. And one document in particular that I'd go to because it's a nice summary, it's called Sustaining Young Forest Communities. There's a lot of wildlife habitat information in there. And that's co-edited by Frank and also Katie Greenberg and Beverly Collins. If you also would like to explore some collaborations on this topic, please be in touch with Frank or myself or Jonathan, and we can see what we can do. The next webinar will be on February 27th at 2 o'clock, and this one will be on integrating data from a variety of sources to produce high-quality, low-cost information. So this is a data management webinar. So thank you again, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you very much. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.
Greg Flood signing off.